at 03:17 local time, in the cold blue heart of the Veyran Imperial Citadel, Ambassador Elias Vance stood alone beneath a ceiling painted with the victories of other species. The paint was flaking. Gold leaves drifted down from a mural of conquered suns and settled on the shoulders of dead guards. That was how empires died, not with one great explosion, with small things first, cracks in the art, hungry soldiers, silent radios, doors that no longer opened when they were supposed to. And somewhere below the marble floors of the Citadel, 6 alien delegations were preparing to turn a political collapse into a slaughter that would stain half the Orion Reach for 1,000 years. Elias Vance was 71 years old. He had arthritis in both hands. He had a repaired lung from the siege of Jakarta Orbital. He had a daughter buried on Luna. He had exactly 2 hours until dawn, and he had not come armed. If you stay with this story, you will see one old human, trapped in the capital of a dying empire, walk into a room full of enemies and stop a genocide without firing a single shot. Not because he was stronger than them, not because humanity had a fleet over the horizon, but because the one thing every empire underestimates about humans is this: we can wait longer than hatred can breathe. The Veyran capital was called Seraph. For 300 years, the Veyran Imperium had ruled 28 systems through tribute, fear, and ritual humiliation. Their governors wore silver masks in conquered worlds. Their judges never raised their voices. Their armies arrived with musicians before artillery because they considered terror an art form. They had tried that performance on humanity 83 years earlier. It had gone badly for them. Humans had entered the galactic stage poor, divided, late, and living on a death world every sensible species found absurd. Our gravity was too high. Our pathogens were too aggressive. Our weather too violent. Our food chemistry was concerning to most of the civilized species. Nahadrik Observer had once written that Earth seemed less a cradle than a machine for grinding weakness into bone. That line had become famous after the human expansion fleets crossed the Perseus Lane and shattered 3 pirate kingdoms using freighters converted into missile barges. But the war with the Veyrans had never become the grand crusade so many expected. There had been border campaigns, sanctions, proxy fights, supply interceptions, 2 assassinations that both sides denied. A treaty written in bloodless language over very bloody years. And in the middle of that brittle peace sat Elias Vance. He had been a naval intelligence officer in his youth, then a negotiator, then the man government sent when a ceasefire existed on paper and nowhere else. He had a face lined like old leather and eyes that made younger men confess things they had not planned to say. Among humans he was called patient. Among aliens he was called dangerous. Among the Veyrans he was called, with equal parts mockery and respect, the Still One. His official duty in Seraph was simple: maintain treaty contact, monitor the succession crisis, protect human commercial corridors, keep Earth informed. His private duty was harder: to not let the Empire collapse all at once. Because when a large cruel power falls quickly, the dead are rarely limited to the cruel. Elias knew that better than anyone in the Citadel. 32 years earlier, on the colony moon of Kepris, he had misread a rebellion as a negotiating tactic. He had trusted a provincial governor who begged for time. By dawn, militia networks had turned neighbor against neighbor. 80,000 civilians died in 6 districts before outside forces restored order. His wife, Mara, had been on Kopris as a medical attach. She died in a clinic fire started by men who believed peace talks meant betrayal. Elias had never forgiven himself for choosing patience 1 hour too long. That was the wound he carried into Seraph. The quiet fear under all his careful words. Not fear of death, fear of being late. At 03:17, the first sign came not from intelligence channels, but from a child's toy. Elias was in the human embassy annex, reviewing evacuation codes, when he heard music in the corridor outside his office. Thin notes. Metallic. Repeating. His aide, Lieutenant Mara Solano, appeared in the doorway, face pale. "Sir," she said, "we have a courier." He stepped into the corridor. A mechanical bird sat on the floor tiles, tin wings, glass eyes, Veyran craftsmanship, expensive and delicate. It chirped 3 notes, opened its beak, and projected a thread of light into the air. A map of the lower citadel bloomed between them. 6 chambers lit in red. Then one central hall in gold. A woman's voice spoke in trade cant, low and fast. "If you are seeing this, Ambassador, they've moved earlier than planned. Dawn assembly, halls of concordance, target list confirmed, human quarter included to mask intent. They will kill the delegates first, then ignite district cleansing under emergency authority." Stopped speaker tell Severin before the morning bells. The message cut out. The bird folded in on itself and burned from the inside, leaving only a puddle of glowing alloy. Solano stared at it. That was Minister Elias Vance. Elias nodded once. Elias Vance was Veyran nobility, Deputy Minister of Internal Harmony, one of the few in the Imperial government who still believed coexistence was possible, and 3 weeks earlier she had stopped answering private channels. "Is it genuine?" Solano asked. Elias crouched painfully, touched the cooling metal, and smelled the chemical tag in the smoke. "Yes," he said. "She used old archival accelerant. Pre-reformed formula. Nobody under 60 would know it." Solano's jaw tightened. "Then we alert Earth Command. We lock the annex. We prepare exfil." "We alert Earth," Elias said. "We will not have time for exfil." She looked at him sharply. "Sir." He was already walking back to his desk. "Wake Kelm. Wake Dr. Anwar. Bring me every current roster for the 6 delegations and every report on Tal Severin's faction." "See all the weapons cage?" That stopped her. "You want us unarmed?" "I want us alive long enough to be invited into the room." Outside, somewhere over the city, the morning bells had not yet begun. Tal Severin had not always been a monster. Once, he had been a reformer, a scholar orator, a Veyran aristocrat who argued, in careful public language, that the Empire could survive only by loosening its grip on subject worlds. He had charisma, theatrical restraint, and the kind of cultured voice that made brutal ideas sound civilized. Then the Emperor died without naming a stable successor. Then 3 border sectors declared autonomy. Then grain shipments failed. Then military governors began keeping tax fleets for themselves. Then refugees flooded Seraph from outer moons stripped bare by retreating garrisons. Empires under pressure do not become honest. They become inventive. Severin reinvented himself as the guardian of order. He spoke of contamination, of disloyal bloodlines, of species whose presence inside the capital had weakened the imperial spirit. He promised a cleansing emergency, brief but necessary, to preserve civilization from disintegration. The 6 non-Veyran delegations in Seraph were supposed to be protected under treaty immunity. Instead, they had become hostages waiting for the excuse that would make their deaths legal. One delegation was Hadric, towering methane brothers in pressure veils, veterans of industrial worlds. One was Selka, amphibious traders with memories like ledgers and a talent for revenge. One was Rune, insectile hive diplomats who spoke in harmonized triads. One was Sithari, thin, feathered strategists who treated etiquette like weaponized mathematics. One was Dalmor, heavy-boned miners from high-gravity moons, too proud to beg and too stubborn to retreat. And one was human. All 6 had old grudges. All 6 suspected the others of preparing betrayal. If Severin could kill one by dawn and frame another, the city would ignite. That was the plan Ilia Wren had risked her life to expose. By Duel 3 Cordiordan, Elias had assembled what remained of his inner circle in the embassy war room. Lieutenant Marcelano stood by the display wall, sleeves rolled, dark hair tied back, eyes hot with urgency. At 34, she had the blunt confidence of an officer raised during the Belt Wars, when hesitation got ship-cemented. Across from her sat Dr. Idris Anwar, the embassy's cultural analyst, thin and soft-spoken, fingers always folded as if in prayer even when discussing massacre probabilities. Beside the door loomed Kelm of Threeglass, the Hadric security liaison assigned under treaty exchange. His pressure harness hissed softly with each breath. On the central table, the Citadel map glowed. Solano pointed at the 6 red chambers. Delegates were moved from their residential suites to secured meeting rooms 90 minutes ago. Official reason, anti-riot precautions. Meaning containment, Kelm rumbled through his translator. Anwar nodded, and the Hall of Concordance is symbolic. Old imperial law permits emergency military decrees there if witnessed by quorum officials. How many officials? Elias asked. 7. Severin can produce them. Can he produce legitimacy? Anwar hesitated. If the city panics enough, yes. Solano crossed her arms. Then we don't let him convene. We extract whoever we can and burn our way out if needed. Kelm's heavy head turned toward her. Human idiom noted. Burning the capital may complicate diplomacy. She gave him a flat look. Metaphorical. Probably. Elias studied the map in silence. That silence was part of why people followed him. He did not rush to fill fear with noise. He let the shape of disaster become visible. Finally, he said, "What does Severin need?" Anwar answered first. A triggering outrage. More specific. Proof, Anwar said, or something close enough that one delegation planned violence against another. Once blood is drawn, emergency doctrine lets him frame a purge as peacekeeping. Solano leaned over the table. So we warn the delegations. No, Elias said. 3 faces turned to him. No, Solano repeated. If we warn them in the abstract, they fortify, accuse, and preempt. Each believes the other's capable of treachery. Fear will do Severin's work for him. Then what exactly is your plan, sir? Elias looked at the golden chamber in the map center. We go to the Hall of Concordance. Solano almost laughed. With what authority? With the only authority collapsing powers still respect, he said. A witness they cannot predict. Kelm's translator clicked thoughtfully. You intend to place yourself between factions? I intend, Elias said, to force them to reveal who is lying before the room can become a battlefield. Anwar's face tightened. Ambassador, if Wren's message means what I think it means, she is either already dead or being watched. Severin will anticipate interference. He will anticipate armed interference. Solano looked at the sealed weapons locker visible through the side glass. You are asking us to walk into a coup naked. No, Elias said. I am asking us to walk in as diplomats. At 04,000 fear, the city lights dimmed. Power rationing. Through the embassy windows, Seraph became a mass of black water, dark towers, and emergency strips of violet running along bridge spines and sky rails. Then, the first bell sounded. Not loud. Not dramatic. One deep iron note from somewhere in the inner district. Kelm tilted his head. Morning bell. For whom? Solano asked. Elias already knew. For Minister Wren, he said quietly. No one spoke after that. The convoy they were granted was insultingly small. 1 embassy transport, 2 Veyran escorts who made no effort to hide their contempt, 3 route clearances, all provisional. As the transport crossed the inner ring causeway, Elias watched the capital sliding toward panic. Shops shuddered. Crowds surged around ration depots. Imperial banners had been torn from 2 towers and replaced with black cloth. On a balcony above a public square, a Veyran woman screamed accusations at a line of armored constables until one struck her hard enough to send her over the rail. Nobody stopped walking. Solano saw it too. "You were right," she said without looking at him. "Too late for normal procedure." Elias kept his gaze on the city. Normal procedure was dead a week ago. "We're here to decide what replaces it." She glanced at him. "How are you this calm?" He almost smiled. "I'm not calm, Lieutenant. I'm old." That earned half a breath of laughter, going as quickly as it came. Then the transport lurched to a stop. Kelm's harness vented sharply. Blockade. Head, the causeway was choked with maintenance crawlers, set crosswise, in deliberate obstruction. Beyond them, a cluster of civilians hammered on the locked gates of an inner checkpoint, while soldiers watched from behind barricades. One of the Veyran escort officers turned from the front compartment. His silver half-mask reflected dashboard light. "Road closure," he said. "Reading in lower avenues. Return to embassy." "No." "By whose signature?" The officer hesitated one fraction too long. Solano noticed. So did Kelm. Elias leaned forward. "If this closure is lawful, officer, you will provide the authorizing code and escort us through an alternative corridor. If it is unlawful, then you are interfering with treaty movement inside a protected diplomatic lane in the presence of a human ambassador, 100 treaty witness, and 2 embedded recorders." The officer stiffened. That was not true, but certainty is often more useful than truth in the first 3 seconds of confrontation. The officer turned away, muttered into his comm, then slapped the divider shut. Solano exhaled slowly. "You bluffed him." Elias looked forward again. You reminded him that uncertainty is contagious. 5 minutes later, the blockade shifted just enough to let them pass. At 04:06, they entered the Hall of Concordance. A domed chamber of greenstone and silver ribs, with banners hanging like old wounds from the upper balconies. At the center stood a circular floor of polished black glass, beneath which shallow water moved over white light, creating the illusion that everyone who crossed it walked above a lit abyss. The 6 delegations had already arrived. The 100 contingent stood in a cluster near the western arch, pressure veils glimmering. The Selka delegation occupied a humidified enclosure, their slick gray skin flashing iridescent patterns of agitation. Through rune envoys clicked and thrummed to each other in triadic bursts. A pair of Citari stood feather still, their golden facial crests held high in studied contempt. The Dalmor representative, General Brock, broad as a transport loader, had positioned himself with his back to a pillar like a man expecting gunfire from every direction. And at the northern dais, framed by imperial banners, stood Speaker Tal Severin. He wore mourning white. That was the first cruelty, not armor, not command black. Mourning white, as though he were already the victim of the violence he intended to unleash. His silver throat collar marked him as temporary voice of imperial continuity. His hands were folded. His expression was grave enough to pass for sincere from a distance. "Ambassador Vance," he said, voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. Your presence is unexpected. I'm told the same can be said of this assembly, Elias replied. Some of the delegates shifted. Some looked relieved. Others looked more frightened. Good, Elias thought. Relief was dangerous. Fear kept people listening. You arrived during a tragedy. Minister Elias Vance was murdered less than an hour ago by unknown extremists seeking to destabilize the capital. In light of this, I have gathered the resident delegations for their own protection. The lie was polished, effortless, ready. Elias walked onto the black glass floor, cane tapping once against its surface, though he needed it less for support than timing. Protection, he said, usually includes unlocked exits. A murmur passed through the room. General Brock of the Dalmore turned sharply toward the nearest door and saw what the others had already suspected. Magnetic seals, armed guards outside the frosted panels. The giant miner bared squish grinding teeth. This is detention. Severin spread his hands. This is emergency order. One of the Centaurian voice spoke in a flute-sharp voice. Under what legal article, speaker? Severin did not look at him. Under the article that keeps mobs from ripping each other apart in the streets tonight. Elias stopped at the center of the floor. Below his boots, white light rippled through the water. He felt every eye in the chamber. Good. A stage, then. Speaker Severin, he said. Before emergency authority is recognized by treaty observers, the cause for emergency must be made plain. What precisely do you allege? Severin's gaze cooled. Yeah, they get that one among these delegations conspired in Minister Wren's death and in coordinated riots now erupting across 3 districts. Which one? Would it be responsible? Severin asked. To speak that accusation before confirmation, the Selka chief delegate made a wet, hissing sound. You have already caged us. Speak plainly, Carrion Prince. That got attention. Insult from a Selka informal assembly was no small thing. Severin allowed himself the tiniest pause, as if wounded by incivility. Then he said, evidence recovered near the minister's residence indicates ruined operatives. The hull changed. It happened in an instant. The Rune Triad recoiled in cheering outrage. The Hodric shifted toward them. The Dalmor general cursed aloud. The Sathari narrowed their predatory eyes. And the Sulka representative smiled with all the warmth of an opened knife. The Rune had old blood debts with the Selka over shipping assassinations in the Quell lanes. If the Rune broke, those 2 species would go first. No, Elias said. He did not shout. He simply said it as if reality had consulted him. The room held. Severin looked annoyed for the first time. Ambassador, this is not a human proceeding. No, Elias said. It is an imperial proceeding under treaty observation, which means if accusation has begun, evidence must be shown now. Severin's eyes hardened. You presume much. I have learned the cost of presuming too little. For a moment, something old and dangerous passed between them. They knew each other, not as friends. As craftsmen in adjacent trades. Severin gestured, and an aide emerged carrying a data prism. The aide's hands trembled. Intercepted traffic, Severin said. Encoded rune harmonic bursts near the minister's residence. Security visuals show a tree-limbed figure entering the lower service court. The rune clicked furiously. Translator screens filled with overlapping denials. Elias did not look at them. He looked at the aide. Young. Afraid. Thin silence followed. Every delegate was watching now. Refusal would smell like fraud. Severin gave the smallest nod. The aide descended the dais and handed the prism to Elias with shaking fingers. "Thank you," Elias said softly. He examined the projection. Security angle. Figure entering a side court under rain. Tri-limbed silhouette, yes, but many service exosuits could create the same profile. Timestamp valid. Audio overlay included harmonic pulses. Anwar, standing near the rear wall, caught Elias's eye and touched 2 fingers to his own wrist. Rhythm. Of course. Elias raised the prism. "These harmonic bursts," he said, "were translated as Ruin tactical code." Severin inclined his head. "Correct. And who performed that translation?" "Imperial Internal Security." "Which department?" A pause. "Civic Stabilization." That was not the department that handled Ruin harmonics. Anwar had taught Elias that months ago over tea and stale embassy biscuits. Elias handed the prism back to the aide, not to Severin. "The pattern is wrong," he said. "I cannot translate Rune speech," Elias said, "but I know enough to recognize cadence. Tactical harmonics use closure repetition every 5th pulse. These bursts repeat every 4th. They are not commands. They are liturgical notation." Now the Rune triad went silent. All 3 heads tilted toward Elias in shocked unison. Anwar stepped forward carefully. "If I may, Ambassador?" Elias nodded. Anwar addressed the room. Rune death observances from the 3rd Brute Choir use 4-pulse grief sequences. A common recording was distributed in the Memorial District yesterday after the canal bombing. Anyone with access to public archives could have overlaid it. Severin's mask slipped for 1 dangerous second. Only 1 second. But Elias saw it. And more importantly, so did the others. General Brack growled. "Forgery." The Selka delegate pressed both webbed hands to the humidified barrier and hissed a curse. Severin recovered immediately. "Interesting speculation. Not exoneration. The visual remains." "Then enlarge the frame," Elias said. "It has already been analyzed." "Then you won't object." Again. At the edge of the frame, just for a flicker, a reflection in wet stone, not a 3rd limb, a ceremonial shoulder vein, Satari design. One of the feathered envoys made a sharp, distressed trill. The other snapped his crest flat in alarm. Severin's gaze cut toward them too quickly, not surprise. Containment. Elias turned toward the Satari. "Did either of your delegation visit Minister Wren tonight?" "No," said the taller envoy instantly. The smaller one hesitated. There it was. Elias faced him. "Your name?" "Archivist Sental," the Satari said quietly. "Did you visit Wren?" Sental's throat fluttered. "Yes." The room erupted. Questions. Accusations. Translator lag turned outrage into a wall of overlapping sound. Severin lifted both hands as if to restore order. But Elias stepped forward first. "Silence." Age gave his voice a rasp. Loss gave it weight, and somehow, impossible as it seemed, the room obeyed him over the Imperial speaker. Elias looked only at Sental. Why? The Cethary swallowed. Minister Ran requested historical verification. She feared certain succession seals were falsified. She asked for my discretion. Did you kill her? No. Who else was present? Sental trembled. A Veyran guard captain, white insignia, internal harmony crest. He dismissed me before the shouting began. Elias felt the shape of the trap click into place, not random fabrication, layered fabrication, ruin audio. Cethary reflection. Enough truth inside the lie that every species would suspect every other one. Severin moved to speak, but Elias turned on him with sudden force. You were not trying to frame the ruin, he said. Severin stopped. You were trying to force all 6 delegations into mutually exclusive testimony. Once one lied out of fear, the room would fracture on its own. Severin's expression became utterly still, and if that were true, then Ren found something worth killing for. That landed harder than any accusation yet, because now the question was no longer who murdered a minister. It was what she had discovered. Midpoint. The true war entered the room there. Severin descended fully from the dais. No more distance, no more benevolent official posture. Now he stood on a glass floor with Elias, 2 old men surrounded by armed history. Very well, Severin said softly. Let us stop pretending this is a matter of one dead minister. His voice no longer reached for comfort. It reached for belief. The Empire is collapsing, he said to the chamber. Its fleets have broken, its governors hoard food, outer worlds burn, and each of you waits to carve your justice from our courts. No one interrupted him. Do not insult me with Denial, he continued. The Hedrick have mobilized Lapper legions on our northern moons. The Dalmor have armed merchant hulls in the west corridor. The Sulka have suspended debt relief in 3 Veyran ports. Humanity itself has emergency cruisers hiding beyond treaty range. He turned, eyes glittering. You all smell death. You are all here for inheritance. General Brack slammed a fist against his own chest plate. We came because your emperor swore immunity. An emperor whose bones are cold, Severin replied. Treaties do not survive carrion winters. Then his gaze returned to Elias. But some futures are worse than civil war, Ambassador. You know this. You have seen what comes after authority dies. Kebris, the clinic fire. Mara's last message, full of smoke and interrupted apologies. Yes, Elias knew. That was why Severin had chosen this argument. Not because it was false, because it was partly true. If the capital fractures before dawn, Severin said, millions die. If 6 foreign species answer local violence with retaliation, the Empire becomes a feeding ground. But if I act now, hard and swiftly, there is still one path to order. By slaughtering hostages, by narrowing the firebreak, Severin said, by identifying enemy elements and removing them before mob contagion spreads. He turned in a slow circle, offering his profile to every delegation like an actor at final curtain. His story does not ask whether power was gentle in the hour of collapse. It asks whether anyone remained alive to remember law. There it was, the seductive logic of atrocity. The promise that horror, if disciplined enough, becomes virtue. Elias had heard versions of it from admirals, revolutionaries, insurgents, presidents, and priests. Every age invented new words for the same old hunger. He said, and who decides which populations count as kindling? Severin met his gaze. I do. No masks now. No softness. Just ambition sharpened by panic. Dr. Anwar stepped closer to Elias and whispered, he has military backing, at least part of the garrison. I know, Elias murmured. How? Solano asked under her breath from the rear flank. On the upper balcony, behind the decorative lattice, movement. Rifle silhouettes. Not many. Enough. Severin was prepared to end the assembly by force if persuasion failed. Elias needed time, but not passive time, directed time. He straightened slowly. "You are wrong about one thing, Speaker." Severin's lips thinned. "Only one? You think everyone in this room came to inherit your empire?" "And they did not?" "No," Elias said. "One came to bury it cleanly." The line puzzled the room. "Good." Confusion widened cracks. "General Brack," he said, "when Dalmor clans prepare for siege extraction, do they cede corridor charges before negotiation?" Brack frowned. "Of course." "Did you?" Verklant? Chief Naren, if your syndics planned to profit from district purges, would your traders still be clustered in the river warehouses? A shimmer crossed her skin. No. They would already be gone. Tadahadrik, Elias said. If labor legions intended immediate intervention, would your breather barges still be venting low over the southern docks, where every militia cannon can track them? Kelm answered for his people. No. One by one, Elias forced practical truths into the room. Not theories, logistics. Actual intentions leave footprints. Predators about to strike do not stand in exposed positions with unloaded exits and public manifests. Only trapped parties do that. The delegates were realizing the same thing. Severin said coldly, "This proves nothing." "It proves," Elias said, "that your emergency narrative depends on us being as frightened and impulsive as you need us to be." Then he played the card he had been holding since the convoy. The inner checkpoint on the West Causeway was sealed without proper authority 30 minutes before this assembly, he said. That means district movement restrictions were in place before Minister Wren's death was announced. Which means your forces were already positioning for coordinated confinement. Now even the Veyran aides near the days shifted. Severin did not move. How interesting. It becomes more interesting, Elias said, if Wren discovered falsified succession seals, because then you are not merely containing unrest. You are manufacturing legal continuity for a regime no lawful council would grant. Among the Veyrans, legitimacy was not decorative. It was sacred machinery. If Severin had forged succession authority, then every soldier obeying him was standing on collapsing ground. And then, from the eastern side of the chamber, a new voice spoke. Every head turned. A side service door, half hidden behind drapes, slid open. A Veyran woman entered with dried blood across one sleeve and a burn mark along her jaw. Minister Elias Vance. Not relief. Pure calculation meeting ruined timing. Wren walked with a limp but held herself straight. 2 Citadel clerks followed her, frightened and carrying case boxes marked with archable insignia. Solano exhaled, barely audible. Impossible. No. Elias said quietly. Wren stopped 3 paces from Elias. You were supposed to receive my message and stay away, she said. Elias gave the smallest shrug. I've never been gifted with obedience. Despite everything, the corner of her mouth twitched. Then she faced the room. Speaker Tulseverin ordered the suppression of Imperial succession records after the Emperor's death, she said. He replaced 3 genealogical seals and 1 military ratification with forged copies produced in the lower scriptoria. When I confronted him, he offered me a place in the Restoration Council. And when you refused, asked the Sethari archivist Sentao. Ren's eyes remained on Severin. He sent Captain Oren Dath to arrest me. Captain Dath is dead. I am not. The original seals are here. The clerks raised the case, boxes like trembling offerings. The hall exploded again. This time the sound was different, not reactive fury, political panic. Because forgery could topple a faction faster than any bomb. Severin lifted one hand. There it was, the moment where politics reached its edge and stared down into violence. Solano saw them too. Her whole body changed, weight shifting, eyes measuring distances she could not cover unarmed. Kelm lowered his horns. General Brack took one step in front of his own aides. The ruin clustered tight. The Sulka delegate's skin darkened into war patterning. One order, one shot. The hall would become a species riot inside 10 seconds. Elias felt his pulse in the scar tissue around his ribs. This was the hour he had feared since Kepris, not the argument. The instant after argument fails, Severin's voice rang through the chamber. Minister Ren has been grievously manipulated, he said. The records are compromised. The foreign delegations have colluded to destabilize lawful authority. Not desperate, certain. Severin stopped, perhaps from irritation, perhaps because old instincts told him that anyone this calm at gunpoint might still be dangerous. Elias stepped onto the very center of the glass disc. Light moved beneath him like a pale current. If you fire in this room, he said, you lose. Severin gave a thin smile. Do I? Yes, because every delegation here transmitted attendance pings before entering the hall. That was a gamble. Maybe true for some, not all. He continued without pause. When those pings stop moving and the doors remain sealed, their fleets won't see a tragic emergency. They'll see decapitation. By tomorrow, your city becomes the most legally permissible battlefield in the Reach. Brack rumbled assent. Even the Sethari lifted their crests in cold confirmation. Elias pressed harder. You can massacre us. Absolutely. But then you trade one frightened capital for 6 converging war doctrines. And Speaker, for all your brilliance, you do not have enough empire left to survive that. Severin's jaw flexed. Elias took another step. Paon stabbed his hip. He ignored it. You wanted a clean internal enemy, he said. A purge that could be sold as restoration. But if foreign blood spills here under forged authority, your own commanders will split by noon. Some from outrage, some from fear. Some because they finally see you cannot protect them from what follows. On the balcony, one rifle barrel wavered. Not much. Enough. Loyalty was cracking. Severin saw it too. For the first time that night, uncertainty touched him. So Elias did the hardest thing. He offered him a door. Not mercy. A path. Stand down, Elias said. Open the hall. Submit the seals to public verification. Claim necessity. Claim confusion. Claim rogue elements. You do not care. But stand down now, and there may still be a state left to argue over by sunrise. Solana looked at him sharply. She knew what that meant. He was letting Severin live. After all this, after Ren, after the trap, after the planned slaughter, Elias remembered flames on Kepris. He remembered choosing vengeance in his heart 1,000 times and never getting the dead back once. Severin stared at him with naked contempt. "You think this is compassion?" "No," Elias said. "This is arithmetic." Silence. Then, from above, a new sound. But survival often wears the same face at distance. Severin turned slowly toward the balcony. He realized, too late, that proof of forgery had done more than discredit him. Not for a failed fraud whose death orders could become tomorrow's prosecution. Ren spoke, voice clear despite blood loss. "Tal. It is over." He looked at her, and for a moment the monster receded enough to reveal the man he had once been. Tired. Brilliant. Terrified of chaos. Consumed by the belief that only his hand on the throat of history could keep it from screaming. "That is the tragedy of you," Ren said softly. "You were almost right about the danger. You were only wrong about becoming it." His shoulders dropped. Tiny movement. World-changing consequence. The guards at the doors received some silent signal from somewhere outside the hall. Their magnetic seals disengaged with a heavy clunk. No one rushed immediately. No one trusted it yet. Then General Brock laughed once, disbelieving and harsh. The Selka enclosure hissed open. The ruin emitted a trembling triad of relief. Kelm let out a methane gust so forceful his harness whined. Severin stood very still as Veyran constables, this time not his own men, entered from the southern arch with weapons raised at him. He could have tried to run. He did not. As they approached, he said to Elias without looking at him, "You will regret preserving this empire." Elias answered, "I didn't preserve it." Then he looked around the chamber at the delegations, the open doors, the blood on Ren's sleeve, the shaking clerks with the original seals, the balcony marksman discovering conscience through self-interest. "I preserved the morning." By 05 Elva, the first true light had begun to touch the upper towers of Seraph. The genocide did not happen. That does not mean peace did. The capital awoke to barricades, arrests, denunciations, emergency councils, 3 attempted retaliatory strikes, and 1 dockside firefight between rival Veyran naval units. In the outer districts, mobs still formed. Some still killed. Collapse, once invited into a system, does not leave because one room chose restraint. But because that room did choose it, the violence remained fragmented instead of sanctified. That made all the difference. Once genocide gains legal language, it recruits ordinary people. Once it becomes merely one faction's failed crime, people hesitate. Commanders stall. Bureaucrats misplace orders. Pilots demand signatures. Clerks ask questions. And in that hesitation, lives survive. The 6 delegations did not suddenly become friends. General Brock accused the Selka of profiteering before breakfast. The Selka accused everyone of amateurism before lunch. The Sethari buried themselves in archival review like priests seeking absolution in paperwork. The ruin demanded a public recitation clearing their choir pattern from the murder forgery. The Hadrik began unloading atmosphere shelters for refugee zones whether the city wanted help or not. Humanity sent no fleet. Not that day. Instead, Earth transmitted something more devastating to collapsing power structures than warships. Observers, auditors, mediators, supply guarantees tied to inspection rights. Legal recognition for a transitional council, only if cross-species immunity held. Patience, formalized. Some called it restraint, others called it predation by softer means. Both were correct. 3 days after the Hall of Concordance, Elias sat in a narrow recovery chamber overlooking the black inland sea while a med unit injected anti-inflammatory gel into his hands. He hated med units. They beat head smugly. Across from him, Lieutenant Solano stood by the window with a cup of bitter Veyran root tea she refused to admit she liked. "You should have let us carry sidearms," she said. "That would have gotten us searched harder. We might still have needed them." "We might," Elias agreed. She turned toward him. The anger she had carried all night had cooled into something more complicated. "You offered him a way out." "Yes. He would have murdered every person in that hall." "Yes." She looked down at her tea. "My brother died on Colvest because a local governor was given a way out. He used the time to evacuate his favorites and shell the rest." That surprised her. He went on. "I also read your disciplinary notes. You strike first when authorities start speaking about necessary losses." She didn't deny it. "Sometimes," Elias said. "You are right too." "And tonight?" "Tonight," he said. "I needed his followers to see. I was not cornering him into martyrdom. I needed them to calculate survival apart from him. If I made death his only exit, more of them would have fired." Solano stared at him, not fully convinced, but thinking. "That's the part they never teach in War College," she said quietly. "What part? That mercy can be a weapon." Elias flexed his numbed fingers. "It can. But only if you're willing to watch the person who deserves none of it keep breathing." There was a knock. Minister Wren entered without waiting for permission, moving slower than before but wrapped now in a formal dark robe that concealed bandaging beneath the collar. Solano straightened. "Minister." "Lieutenant." Wren looked at Elias' hands. "Age is uncivilized. It beats the alternative," he said. She almost smiled, then grew serious. "The Provisional Council has accepted independent verification. Severin is in secured custody. 2 military prefects are contesting jurisdiction. 4 more are pretending they never supported him." "Healthy political reflex," Elias said. Wren came to the window. Together they looked out across Seraph. Smoke still rose from 2 districts. Shuttle traffic crossed the dawn in thin bright lines. "I misjudged him," Wren said at last. Elias did not offer comfort. "That is common when men confuse fear for wisdom." She folded her hands. "I also misjudged you. I believed humans would eventually answer imperial decline the way all rising powers do. Pressure, opportunism. A knife under the table." "Maybe we will," Elias said. Wren studied him. "But not this time. No, not this time." She turned fully toward him. "Why?" Younger man might have answered with ideals, with speeches about justice or coexistence or the bright future of the galactic community. Elias was too old to lie prettily. "Because the fastest way to own a graveyard is to inherit one on fire," he said. "Because if your capital legalized extermination tonight, every border war for the next 100 years would cite it. Because humanity has buried enough people to know what spreads when murder learns ceremony." Wren absorbed that in silence. "And because," he added, "my wife died in a city where everyone waited 1 hour too long to stop decent men from becoming practical monsters." That changed her face. "Not politically. Personally." "I did not know." Not mourning this time. Administrative summons, the music of exhausted governance trying to reassemble itself. Ren bowed her head slightly. Then I owe your debt a debt. Some wounds become systems before they become scars. Yet the slaughter that should have begun before dawn never found its legal blessing. That mattered in every district after. Refugee corridors opened under joint oversight. 2 garrison commanders defected to the Transitional Council after the seal forgeries went public. A naval flotilla in high orbit refused bombardment orders because the chain of authority had become contestable. Riots still took lives, but planned extermination stalled under scrutiny, confusion, and fear of future prosecution. The Empire did not survive in its old form. It fractured, negotiated, shrank. 3 worlds declared independence within the month. 5 more demanded federal status. Trade routes were redrawn, prisons were opened, mass graves were found. History, when cleaned, is rarely flattering. And through all of it, Elias Vance remained in Seraph longer than Earth wanted. His superiors asked, twice, whether the risk to the human ambassador was still acceptable. He replied the same way both times, not leaving yet. Because after the dramatic hour comes the difficult season, the signatures, the witness statements, the tribunal language, the patient prevention of revenge disguised as administration. That was the real shape of his victory. Not a triumphant speech, not a parade, paperwork with consequences. Rooms where people who hated one another were forced to define the exact boundaries of their hatred so it could not become law again. In the evening, near the end of his posting, Elias walked alone through a repaired section of the Hall of Concordance. The cracked glass flooring had been replaced. The balcony lattice where the rifleman once hid had been removed entirely. Sunset bled red through high western windows. He stood at the center of the hall and listened. No shouts, no accusations. Only work crews in distant corridors and water moving beneath the floor. He heard footsteps behind him. Solano approached in civilian embassy gray, carrying a sealed packet. Message from Earth, she said. Good news travels poorly in packets. This isn't good news. It's retirement authorization. He snorted. Approved at last. With honors, she said. And 3 pages of language implying they'd rather you ignored it. He took the packet but did not open it. Solano looked around the empty chamber. You know they'll name this after you in some diplomatic academy. They'd better not. They already have, in all the unofficial courses. He glanced at her. What do they call it? The Vance constraint. That sounded horrible. He said so. She smiled for the first time in days. The principle that a faction cannot be allowed to define emergency reality without cross-hostile witnesses. Elias considered, too long for a plaque. They shorten it in military circles. Oh? She folded her arms. Old man walks into coup. He laughed then. Really laughed. A rough rusted sound that startled even him. When it faded, he looked once more at the hall. I wasn't the only one in that room, he said. No, Solano agreed. But you were the one who understood what all the others feared most. He thought about that. The answer was not death. Not losing power. Not even losing face. It was being forced into a future they did not control. Humans had lived inside that fear for most of our history. Under weather, famine, predators, war, disease, gravity, extinction events, each other. Maybe that was why we had become so dangerous when underestimated. We learned to function without guarantees, to bargain in darkness, to survive long enough for our enemy's certainty to crack. That was not nobility, it was adaptation. And in the galaxy, adaptation wins more wars than glory ever will. He read the first page, grunted, folded it shut again. "Well?" Solano asked. "They're offering me a desk on Luna." We looked out through the western windows where Seraph's towers caught the last light like blades dipped in fire. "I think," he said, "I'll go home for a while." Home, not because Earth had become simple. It never was. Not because he was done with grief. He never would be. But because for one night in a dying empire he had finally arrived in time. Years later, when school archives and military forums and dockside bars told the story, they got most of it wrong. Some said Elias Vance had blackmailed 6 species at once. Some said he had hidden a human strike fleet behind the moon. Some said he had poisoned Severin's guards. One ridiculous version claimed he was a retired assassin who carried monofilament wire in his cane. The truth was less glamorous and far more human. He listened. He remembered. He recognized the shape of a lie because he had once paid for one with everything. He understood that hatred wants speed, witnesses, and a legal mask. So he denied it all 3. He slowed the room. He forced the witnesses to stay. He tore off the mask. That was enough. And sometimes enough is the deadliest thing a human being can bring into a war. If you enjoyed this story, stay with Midnight Galaxy for more tales from the darkest stars, where humanity survives, endures, and changes the fate of empires.